It is December 31st, 1994. Midnight is approaching. Across Russia, across Europe, across the world, families are gathered. Tables are full of food. Children are staying up past their bedtime. People are kissing and laughing and making promises about the year ahead. But in the dark, cold countryside south of the Russian border, thousands of young men are sitting inside metal vehicles, listening to the engines rumble, watching the road disappear into the blackness ahead of them. They are soldiers. Most of them are teenagers or barely into their 20s. Some of them have been in the army for only a few months. Some of them have never fired a weapon in a real combat situation. They are rolling toward a city called Grozny, and they have been told this will be easy. It will not be easy. What is about to happen inside that city will shock the Russian military, shock the world, and leave thousands of families destroyed. It will become one of the most studied and most tragic urban battles in modern military history. This is the story of the Battle of Grozny. It is a story about soldiers, about decisions made by people far from the fighting, about a city that became a death trap. But more than anything, it is a story about what happens when powerful people convince themselves that a war will be quick and send other people's sons to pay the price when they are wrong. To understand what happened in Grozny, you need to understand something about the place and the people. Chechnya is a small territory in the south of Russia, sitting between the Caucasus Mountains. It is a place about the size of the state of Connecticut, but its history is enormous and painful. For centuries, the Chechen people had been fighting to hold on to their identity, their land, and their way of life. They were conquered by the Russian Empire in the 1800s after a brutal, decades-long war. Under Stalin in 1944, the entire Chechen population, nearly 500,000 people, was forcibly deported to Central Asia in freezing cattle cars. Tens of thousands died. The ones who survived never forgot it, and neither did their children or their children's children. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, something shifted. Republics and regions across the former Soviet world began declaring independence or demanding more freedom. Chechnya was one of them. A former Soviet Air Force general named Dzhokhar Dudayev came to power and declared Chechnya an independent nation. Moscow said that was not going to happen, and for a few years the two sides existed in a tense standoff, until 1994, when the Russian government under President Boris Yeltsin decided it was time to settle the matter by force. The decision to send in the military was not made carefully. Senior officials in Moscow looked at the map, a small territory, a relatively small population, and concluded that the Russian army would walk in, the local resistance would collapse, and it would all be over in 2 weeks. Some accounts suggest that officials promised Yeltsin it could be done in days. The generals had doubts, some officers raised concerns, some outright refused to participate. One senior general publicly called the plan reckless. He was removed from his post. The political decision had already been made, and the military was told to carry it out, and so the order went down the chain of command. Tens of thousands of soldiers were assembled and moved south. Many of them were conscripts, young men fulfilling their mandatory military service, who had received limited training. Some had been told they were going on a peacekeeping exercise. Some had no maps of the city they were about to enter. Some did not even know what city they were going to. Their commanders in many cases were not much better informed. Grozny was not just any city. It was a fully built-up Soviet urban center of around 400,000 people. Wide main roads, yes, but also dense blocks of Soviet-era apartment buildings, 5 and 6 and 7 stories tall, packed close together. Underground infrastructure, basements beneath nearly every building. Alleyways between structures just wide enough for a person to move through, but too narrow for a tank to turn around in. It was a city that had been home to a significant oil industry. It had refineries, industrial facilities, rail yards, and a central train station that sat at the heart of the city like a fortress. The city had layers of streets, layers of buildings, layers of underground passages that people had used for decades. If you wanted to design a city to be a nightmare for an invading armored force, you would design something very much like Grozny. The Chechen fighters who prepared to defend it understood this perfectly. Their commanders, men like Aslan Maskadov, a former Soviet military officer who had served in the Red Army, and Shamil Basayev, who would become one of the most feared guerrilla commanders of his generation, had weeks to prepare while the Russian buildup was happening. They watched the Russian forces assemble. They listened to the radio communications. They studied the roads the columns would take. And then they set their trap and waited. The assault began on the night of December 31st, rolling into the early hours of January 1st, 1995. Multiple armored columns were sent into the city from different directions. The plan was for them to converge in the center, seize key government buildings, and effectively decapitate the Chechen resistance. In theory, it sounded like a military operation. In practice, it was something closer to chaos from the very beginning. The columns had almost no infantry walking alongside the tanks and armored vehicles. The soldiers were inside their vehicles, which sounds safer, but in a city, it is a dangerous place to be. Inside an armored vehicle, you cannot see what is above you, what is beside you, what is waiting for you around the next corner. You are in a metal box moving through streets you have never seen, in a city you do not know. The Chechen fighters let the columns come in. They let them go deep into the city. They let them reach the narrow streets where the buildings rose on both sides, where there was no room to maneuver, no room to turn around, no open ground to retreat to. And then they struck. The tactic was calculated and devastating. They hit the first vehicle in each column and the last vehicle at the same time, blocking the convoy from the front and from the rear simultaneously. In an instant, every vehicle in between was trapped. Nowhere to go forward, nowhere to reverse. Sitting in a narrow street with buildings on both sides and fighters on every floor above them. Then came the rocket-propelled grenades. Cheap weapons, simple to use, but extraordinarily effective in this environment. Russian tanks and armored vehicles are engineered to resist fire from the front, from other tanks at roughly the same level on an open battlefield. They are far more vulnerable from above, from the sides, from the rear. In Grozny, the fighters were on the upper floors of buildings, firing down at the tops of the vehicles, at their engine compartments, at the thin metal around the hatches. Vehicle after vehicle was hit. Some exploded immediately. Some caught fire slowly. Crews tried to escape. When they opened the hatches, they were shot. When they stayed inside burning vehicles, they burned. Radio communications between units broke down almost immediately, partly because of jamming, partly because the chaos was too great, partly because many of the radios simply were not working properly to begin with. Officers were targeted specifically and deliberately. The Chechen fighters understood that a leaderless unit is a helpless unit. Snipers positioned themselves to take officers the moment they appeared. Command vehicles were prioritized as targets. The Russian units, already confused about where they were and what was happening, began losing the people who were supposed to tell them what to do. By the early hours of January 1st, 1995, multiple Russian columns were destroyed or pinned down. Burning armored vehicles lit up the streets of Grozny like terrible torches. Soldiers who had been told this would be easy were dying in the first hours of the new year. Of all the tragedies that unfolded in those first terrible days, the story of one unit stands as perhaps the most painful symbol of everything that went wrong. The 131st Motorized Rifle Brigade, known as the Maikop Brigade, was in many ways one of the better units in the assault. They were more experienced than many of the other conscript forces. They were led by a career officer, Colonel Ivan Savin, and on the night of December 31st, they actually managed to push through to their objective, the central railway station in the heart of Grozny. They took the station, they held their position, and they waited for the support that was supposed to follow them in. It did not come. The other columns had been destroyed or stopped. The 131st Brigade was alone, deep inside enemy territory, cut off, surrounded on all sides. For nearly 3 days, they fought to survive in and around the railway station. They ran low on ammunition. They had wounded men they could not evacuate. They could not get clear communications out to the larger Russian force. Every attempt to break through the encirclement was met with fierce resistance. Colonel Savin was killed in the fighting. He died with his men in the city, trying to hold a position that no one was coming to relieve. When the battle around the railway station was finally over, the 131st Maikop Brigade had been effectively destroyed as a fighting unit. Estimates suggest over 800 soldiers killed or captured, nearly 20 tanks and armored vehicles destroyed, an entire brigade gone. Back in Russia, the families of those men were not being told what had happened. The Russian government was not releasing casualty figures. Mothers and wives and fathers were sitting at home, waiting for word. not knowing if their son or husband was alive or dead or captured. Some of them eventually stopped waiting for official information. They traveled to Chechnya themselves, driving south into a war zone, asking anyone they could find, soldiers, civilians, anyone, if they had seen their son, if they knew where he was, if they knew what had happened to him. That image of Russian mothers traveling into a war zone to find their missing children because their own government would not tell them the truth says more about the cost of this battle than any number ever could. People sometimes look at what happened in Grozny and ask, how? How could a modern army, with tanks and artillery and air power, suffer such catastrophic losses in the first days of a campaign? The answer lies in several places at once. The first is the nature of urban warfare itself. Fighting in cities is the deadliest form of combat there is. It cancels out many of the advantages that a conventionally superior force normally has. Air power becomes harder to use safely when your own troops and civilians are mixed together with the enemy in the same city blocks. Artillery can be used, but every shell that misses its target hits a building, a street, a basement where people are hiding. The attacker has to move through space that the defender already controls, already knows, has already turned into a killing ground. Military academics have a phrase for this: the defender's advantage in urban terrain. It means simply that the person who already knows the ground, every alley, every rooftop, every basement connection, every blind corner, holds enormous power over the person who is entering blind. The Chechens had that advantage completely. The second reason is the training gap. The Russian military of 1994 was not the force it had been a decade earlier. The collapse of the Soviet Union had left the armed forces underfunded, undersupplied, and in many cases demoralized. Conscripts were serving soldiers who had received months, not years, of training. Urban warfare, fighting in a built-up city, room to room, floor to floor, dealing with ambushes from above and below, is one of the hardest military skills to develop. It requires intensive, specialized preparation. Most of the soldiers sent into Grozny had received none of it. The third reason is the failure of intelligence. The Russian commanders entering Grozny did not have accurate, up-to-date information about what was waiting for them. They did not know where the Chechen fighting positions were. They did not have a clear picture of how many fighters were in the city, how they were organized, or what tactics they planned to use. The maps some units were given were outdated. Some were not given adequate maps at all. Going into combat without good intelligence is like walking into a dark room full of furniture. You are going to get hurt, and you will not see it coming until it is too late. The fourth reason is the breakdown of combined arms coordination. A functioning modern military operation in a city requires infantry and armor working together. Soldiers on foot moving with the tanks, protecting the vehicles from close-range threats, while the vehicles provide firepower and protection for the soldiers. The Russian plan sent armored columns in without that infantry support. The vehicles were alone, and in a city, a tank without infantry is almost helpless against fighters in the buildings around it. Put all of these together: urban terrain, undertrained soldiers, poor intelligence, the wrong tactics, and the catastrophe becomes, in hindsight, almost inevitable. The tragedy is that it was not inevitable. It was a choice. Choices made in offices in Moscow by people who were not going to be in those streets. Historians and analysts have debated the exact casualty figures from the First Battle of Grozny and the broader First Chechen War. The Russian government was not transparent with its numbers at the time. What we know is this: Russian military deaths in the full First Chechen War are estimated at somewhere between 5,500 and 14,000, depending on the source and methodology. Tens of thousands more were wounded. In the first days of the Grozny assault alone, hundreds of soldiers were killed. Those are numbers, but numbers after a while stop meaning anything on their own. What they mean, in human terms, is this: a mother in a small Russian city opens her door one day and a man in a uniform is standing there. She knows what it means before he says a word. She has been waiting for weeks, not knowing, holding on to hope that the silence was just the distance, just the chaos of war, just bad communications. And now she knows. What they mean is a father who drives south in his old car because he cannot find out from the army where his son is. He drives past checkpoints. He shows photographs to strangers. He sleeps in his car by the side of the road. He is not a soldier. he is just a father. What they mean is a 19-year-old lying in a basement in a burning city, too afraid to move, listening to the sound of boots on the floor above him, not knowing if they belong to someone who will rescue him or kill him. And it is not only the Russian side that carries this weight. The city of Grozny itself was home to people. Chechen families, yes, but also Russian families who had lived there for generations, who had built their lives there, who had nowhere else to go. Civilians who hid in basements as the city was shelled, people who ran through streets under fire to find food or water, elderly people who could not run at all. Human rights organizations estimate that tens of thousands of civilians were killed in Grozny during the First Chechen War. The exact number will never be known. The city that had once been called one of the most beautiful in the Caucasus region was reduced, block by block and week by week, to rubble. After the catastrophe of the New Year's Eve assault, the Russian military stopped and reconsidered. The commanders changed their approach. Instead of racing armored columns through the streets, they began the slow, grinding, brutal work of destroying the city building by building. Artillery and airstrikes were used to flatten entire blocks before infantry moved in. It was effective in a terrible way. It reduced the ability of the Chechen fighters to use the buildings for cover. But it also meant that Grozny was being systematically destroyed. Every shell that collapsed a building also destroyed someone's home, someone's memories, someone's entire world. The fighting was close and vicious. Soldiers fought room to room, sometimes in complete darkness, never knowing what was on the other side of a door. Chechen fighters would defend one floor, then withdraw through basement tunnels to a building 2 streets away and open fire from a completely different angle. The Russians would clear a block, lose men doing it, move on, and sometimes the fighters would slip back in behind them. It was a battle measured in meters and days. The presidential palace, the symbol of Chechen independence, held out for weeks. When Russian forces finally took it in late January 1995, it was not a victory celebration. It was exhausted, bloodied soldiers standing in the ruins of a building that no longer resembled what it had been. By March 1995, Russian forces had established enough control over the city to claim it. But claiming rubble is not winning a war. The Chechen fighters withdrew into the mountains and the countryside. The war continued for another year and a half, until a ceasefire agreement in 1996 gave Chechnya a degree of effective independence, an outcome that the Russian government had gone to war specifically to prevent. The battle had achieved the opposite of its stated goal. It had not crushed the Chechen resistance, it had hardened it. The Battle of Grozny forced military establishments around the world to take a hard look at how modern armies fight, or fail to fight, in cities. At West Point, the United States Military Academy, the battle became required study. Military analysts wrote papers, officers attended lectures. The failure of the Russian initial assault was examined in close detail, and the lessons were the same ones that soldiers have been learning and forgetting since armies first tried to fight in cities. Never underestimate the defender on home ground. Never send armor into narrow streets without infantry support. Never assume that firepower alone can substitute for planning. The Russian military itself drew lessons from what happened. When Russia fought the Second Chechen War beginning in 1999, the approach to Grozny was different, more methodical, more reliant on firepower before movement. The result was still devastating, for the city, for civilians, for everyone involved. But it was not the same kind of catastrophic first-day collapse that had happened in 1994. But there are lessons that cannot be fixed by changing tactics. The deeper failure in 1994 was not a failure of military technique. It was a failure of honesty. The failure of people in power to honestly assess what a war would cost, to honestly prepare the men they were sending, to honestly tell the families of those men what was happening. That kind of failure is harder to address. It requires a political culture willing to admit what war actually is. For the families of the soldiers who died, the aftermath was its own long battle. Russia did not hold a public reckoning with the losses. There were no official ceremonies that acknowledged the full scale of what had happened. Journalists who tried to report honestly on the war faced pressure and threats. Anna Politkovskaya, a Russian journalist who spent years documenting what happened in Chechnya, speaking to soldiers, to mothers, to survivors on all sides, was shot and killed in Moscow in October 2006. The full truth of her murder has never been fully addressed in a Russian court. The soldiers who came home from Grozny came home to a country that was not entirely sure how to receive them. Some received recognition. Many struggled with what they had seen and done. Some spoke about it, many did not. War does not end when the shooting stops. It follows people home and lives there quietly or not so quietly for the rest of their lives. Today, Grozny is a rebuilt city. If you visited it now, you would see modern towers, shopping centers, wide streets with traffic moving through them. A visitor who did not know the history might never guess what this ground once held, but the ground remembers. Underneath the new foundations are the old ones. In the walls of the rebuilt buildings are the echoes of the destroyed ones. And in the people who lived through it, in Chechnya and in the towns and villages of Russia where the dead came from, the memory does not rebuild as quickly as concrete. The Battle of Grozny was deadly for Russian troops for reasons that were, in most cases, preventable. It was deadly because the decision to go to war was made too quickly, with too much confidence and too little honesty about what that war would actually require. It was deadly because the soldiers sent to fight it were not given what they needed. Not the training, not the intelligence, not the equipment, not the honest understanding of what they were walking into. It was deadly because the city they entered was a defender's dream and an attacker's nightmare. And the men who ordered the assault either did not know that or did not care enough to stop. Every war produces arguments afterward. Arguments about who was right, who was wrong, which side had justice on its side. Those arguments will continue about Chechnya for a long time. But whatever your view of the politics, whatever side of history you stand on, there is one thing that is simply true. The young men who went into Grozny on New Year's Eve 1994 did not make the decision to go. They went because they were told to. They went because they had no choice. They were placed into a situation that others had created, with plans that others had made, for goals that others had defined. And they paid the price. The least we can do, the absolute least, is remember them clearly. Not as statistics, not as footnotes, not as the acceptable cost of someone else's political calculation, but as people, as young men who were cold and frightened and far from home, who thought about their mothers and their families in the last moments they had, who deserved better than what they were given. Remember them.